I know that there's tremendous pressure that comes from having a 24/7 media cycle. There's no doubt that, and I think it's here to stay, isn't it? Between the social media, the pressures on time, we have a whole new generation coming up that just lives and breathes this way. As a lecturer, we're told that we don't have more than 7 minutes of attention. You know, that's the attention span. Given that this is the reality, what opportunities do you see coming from this for government? We talk a lot about some of the fears and the challenges, but what opportunities do you think that arises?
Maybe I'll just jump in to start, but my observation was government needs to learn how to work like that. It's no point sort of bemoaning that people haven't got a long time to read the 10,000 word document or to get inside the latest sort of deep thinking on policy design. I suspect it was always so, by the way, we just sort of kidded ourselves. But governments do need to start thinking like that and chunking the way they want to engage and doing it. The tool sets are really easy to use. It's more capability and a will to want to do it. I'd say it's the will piece. And once you start doing it, you'll feel that feedback loop. I think Bill English was talking about this today, the listen, the feedback. And all of a sudden, you'd just be amazed at the quality that starts coming back. And you'll get the sort of feedback that governments do need. And if they're responsive and can feed that in and find a way to do it. And it's not this sort of old-fashioned, let's have a consultation paper, let's listen to the issues, let's go back one more time, get a few more and then so we finish. It's a very dynamic system. So really relearning in a big way how to do that sort of work. And it's not just government, by the way, it's, I think broadly other institutions. But.
Certainly as academics we feel that same pressure in learning. How do we resist to maintain quality? How do we adapt to to really embrace? It is an ongoing challenge. Michelle or Stephen, any comments?
I think there is an opportunity from time to time to destroy the credibility of idle speculation and to build the credibility of government. There is a lot that comes in daily, as everyone in this room knows, which is utter nonsense. And from time to time, not all of it, from time to time, I think there is value in just knocking over the most idle speculation and demonstrating that beyond doubt. And I notice with the Huffington Post, for example, when they quote Donald Trump in their news reports now, they normally put a disclaimer across the bottom that says something like, and I'm paraphrasing, Donald Trump is a serial liar. And obviously what they're saying is right. There's a welter of evidence on that. And I think from time to time, governments can simply put an enormous, gaping, bleeding hole in some of their critics by pointing out the nonsense that's there, and being assertive about what government is actually endeavouring to do. And I just make this point for the cricket fans here. Please bear in mind, Ricky Ponting didn't try and hit every ball in his career. There are some that you just let go over your shoulder to the keeper, and that's intelligent craft too.
I'd just add that I think what Stephen says is correct. We're a fact-based approach to some of the nonsense that appears on social media is a very good strategy, and it's often very simple and effective to do. I think the police forces around the country are a good example of organisations that have been quick to adapt and put out information on social media that can be used by citizens. And there have been many examples where, rumours have emerged during a police operation of some sort, and they will correct it immediately.
You do need to be careful, though, and I found myself disagreeing a bit with what Steve was saying. Yeah, the world's changed. The Hansons, as we call them, was it the professor from Monash who had the data this morning? 20% of Australia think like that. And their view is legitimate, to the extent of their framework they work within. And I think for too long we've sort of said, well, here's the grown-ups, we know what to do, and you guys don't really understand how sophisticated it is, etc. That power paradigm, I think, is fundamentally shifting. And if you block them out, then they will, turn to people like the Trumps of the world and start, idolising that sort of proposition. And I think that's a real challenge for the system, not to rethink how it engages with those people. It's got to find a language and an ability to work with people like that. It's not necessarily you ever turn them, they'll perhaps always have those views, but to the extent we marginalise them, push them to one side and demean them, then I think that just creates the problem, and that does allow sort of the bigotry and the zealots, etc., to rise. And I think that's a little bit of the issue. I call it the sort of power elite class, tell everyone else what to do. It's probably always been the same, by the way. We don't want to think it's very different. But this, the new technology that's said to democratise big time, and if we don't understand that, then we'll continue to marginalise lots of people.
Yes, but it's not a matter where you simply push people further to the margins. You don't even have to attack the personality involved. I think there's far too much playing of the man and woman in our politics these days. It is possible, though, to take a series of assertions and just demonstrate no, 1, 2, 3, 4, and leave it at that. And that then becomes a question of credibility. And it takes a while, but over time, look at Clive Palmer. I take the point about Hedley Thomas that Michelle made. His credibility went from, is he the dominant voice in Australian politics because he's placed in the Senate, to being an absolute joke. And that was because his credibility was eroded and then destroyed.
I'd add there that, yes, I think, and I alluded to this briefly when I spoke earlier, that if you try and play the person and attack and demonise them personally, it does strengthen their hand, particularly when we're talking about populist candidates. I mean, when Pauline Hanson, in her earlier political incarnation, arose, the Courier Mail newspaper up there applied these same sort of, old-fashioned reporting techniques to scrutinise that party then. So look at the candidates, a couple of them were bankrupt or had criminal records. Look at the policies. And, I guess the following election there, just 3 of the 11 One Nation members were re-elected. So it's logic, it's what Stephen spoke about, and I think the answer is, in the current environment where there's, discussion of migration, for example, and the controversies over levels of Muslim migration. Well, instead of attacking Hanson for her views, because so many people are alarmed about the sort of things she's talking about, resort to fact. How many acts of homegrown terrorism have been committed in Australia by migrants from Muslim countries? Yeah.
And governments
None.
do control a lot of fact. There was one of my observations when I worked within government was, there's tremendous resource in government, and every agency's got a huge amount of facts sitting there which it can work with, And my observation, agencies need to step up into that void. You can't just rely on the political people to take all the arguments. In fact, I think that's where the system's really, not what I call broke, but really weak at the moment. Too many agencies say, oh, we don't do that, that's ministers. Right. I say, no. You run big, major programs here, you engage with these people, you've got a lot of resource and a lot of people with intelligence who can effectively engage. You engage within your brand and your agency proposition, but there's a lot that agencies, I think, need to step in and start taking a real role in this stuff because they've got the information and the intelligence.
It's a challenge, isn't it?
There's an unfolding episode now that I think will be of interest to people. It's an organisation that has quite extraordinary credibility. I'm referring to WikiLeaks and its involvement in the United States presidential election. And the question for today is, has WikiLeaks become a post office box for the GRU, for Russian military intelligence? The answer is probably yes. And what is a fellow in the Ecuadorian embassy in London doing by way of seeking to intervene in the presidential poll, and why? Now, they are real questions about credibility, and that's what I was talking about earlier, to confront those issues and put an alternative set of facts before the public as to why, for example, the last WikiLeaks effort was timed exactly between the Republican and Democratic conventions, and who was being manipulative in that circumstance.
Yeah,
That's what I'm talking
And I
about.
think that's a good example, actually, of the sophistication where public agencies need to, I think, be much sharper about this stuff. I'm sort of fond of saying we live in the sort of Game of Thrones world, and I think you've got a lot of these groups who've been often marginalised big time and suddenly find themselves quite ready to play in the political space, whereas previously they haven't. And it's quite easy, you can be a motoring enthusiast and get into the Australian Senate, if you organise yourself in a right way. And I think a lot of groups, be they women who are saying, well, we should be paid exactly the same as men, or gay people who say they should be able to get married, are saying, well, why do we have to wait around for the political system to do this? We're going to do it. And so they're using much sharper tactics than state governments, Russians or whatever, are well playing this game. You only have to look at the cyber risk issues. And so, it's a bigger play, and it's a much more contrived play that's going on. And agencies, again, really need to get on top of this stuff. You can't just be sitting there and saying, gee, I wonder how Twitter works. There's a whole set of tactics and techniques and lobbying and influence making, and it's very sophisticated. You can get on top of it. It's not something you can't get on top of, but it takes that capability. And if I had one big observation is build that capability and get ready to play in the Game of Thrones world, because all these tribes are moving around all over the world, and they're putting their hand up and we're saying we're not putting up with this nonsense anymore, for better or worse. So for the 20% who feel very marginalised by the current economic system, they're saying we don't want to play. We're playing another game.
And they're having voice that they've never had before.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to move to a question from the pad, which is, in what instances should public servants ignore the media? Alternatively, when should we use new media to run more open policy processes? Anyone?
Well, I just repeat what I said about the Ricky Ponting analogy. It's not necessary to try and hit every ball that comes your way. There are some that you can ignore, and your judgment over time will tell you which issues are going to burn out between 7 a.m. and midday on Sky News. And as Tom said, if you build the capability, your powers of judgment will be enhanced. I think for the strategists, it's a matter of constantly focusing upon the policy issues upon which people are working and talking about them in terms not only where we're going to be in 12 months or 3 years, but why it's important and why it's important to average citizens. Why was the ALP's Medicare campaign so effective? Well, partly because the coalition had form on Medicare. Secondly, the AMA had put it on the agenda, and the issue itself was of critical importance to many millions of Australian families in their kitchens. And the government never addressed
if I was going to jump in on that one, the previous governments had not framed up what they were trying to do with Medicare. So it was just a sitting duck there, in terms of the proposition. My personal view is Medicare feels like the PMG. It's like this sort of old-fashioned payment system sitting there. It could be so much more dynamic, and yet we've now, as a result of this sort of political play, sent it back into the 60s. It's going to sit there like this sort of dead duck, whereas it could be a really powerful, application layer and data layer for everyone, personally and at the system level. But because we've sort of, said no, we're not going to do anything with it, not touch it. And I just don't believe, frankly, that there's the technology capability sitting within that particular Canberra agency to remake Medicare the way you want to do it. You need outside help. And that was the piece that got demonised, for better or worse. Now, I agree with Stephen that the politics sort of set it up. That should have been framed up and need to be framed up well before. So it's a good lesson for everyone. But the net result is, I think, we've now, pushed Medicare back, 40 years. Personal view. But, yeah.
I probably agree with both of you. I think that there's no doubt that the Turnbull government was caught unawares by the Mediscare campaign. I think by the time they reacted, they was too slow to react. By the time they did, the amount of money and media spend they had to throw at it was too great. It got away from them. And I guess that gets back to the question, what issues, it's a bit different in a political campaign, but to day-to-day public service concerns about which issues to ignore and which to jump on. But I guess that shows really in a very clear way what can happen when you make a wrong call.
There's also just a quick good example of someone this morning was pointing out, the demographics. I think George and others were talking about that post-65-year-old group, how powerful they're starting to emerge. And there was Bob Hawke, the patron saint of that group, saying, "Oh, I'm not quite sure about this." And I thought really simple, really cheap sort of ad. But gee, you couldn't have got a better person to do it. Absolutely hit the right demographic. The people are concerned about it. And they just said, gee, I don't think so. And then the politics took off. So it was a really good example of, smart, sharp thinking on comms and the right sort of person. And by the way, that was a 23-year-old who thought of that. That's the other observation on this. I'd say, look, baby boomers need to move over a bit and let the people who understand this stuff do it.
It was Wayne Swan's daughter, wasn't it?
It was Wayne, allegedly, Yeah.
There you go. Generational
They're coming up quick, aren't they? Watch your back. I'd like to take a question from the floor if someone has one. Yes, there's someone there?
You can be rude at this time, so we're getting close to drinks.
That's it, yes.
Thank you very much. It's been really fascinating to learn about your worlds. And I suppose we've heard about how kind of newspapers and broadsheets can help us make sense of this crazy world of information. And at the same time, there's a call for the public service to maybe help people make sense of it as well. Who or what's responsible for teaching maybe the population more broadly the skills they need to better make sense of the world themselves? Kind of every day when you're logging into Facebook and making sense of it. And is there anywhere in the world that's doing that well already in terms of citizen education and critical analysis of social media and online media?
I can jump in first. My personal view is government should not go near there. I've seen those programs with all due respect. They're nice people, great people who run them, but it's just like the grown-ups trying to tell the young-uns how to do it. Governments cannot do that. It's just not what they're made for. Have a view and fund some people who are way out there in the real world to do it, but don't try and do it yourself. Secondly, and I've got 5 kids, so I've got some ability to understand this. And the thing I really noticed, they're really good at working this stuff out themselves. And I think we all probably claimed that when we were that age too. They're pretty good at sifting. I found myself just disagreeing a little bit with Michelle there. The traditional role of mainstream media was to sift and sort, and I think that's still very relevant when it's so much happening. And we go to quality brands to find that. But the punters aren't stupid. They do work this stuff out pretty quickly. They know Kanye West is a liar. They don't need anyone else to tell them that. So it's a sort of, they get this stuff pretty quickly, and they're very used to seeing it all over the place and understanding it, and they've been brought up in it. They're soaked in it day in, day out, and they're pretty quick to sift it. And so is the system. The system calls it out really, really quickly, as we've seen on all sorts of examples. Stephen's example of Michelle's example of the turkey piece. There's a lot happening really quickly, and you can intelligently sort it and understand it much more quickly than anyone else could. So that would be my sort of observation. But the short answer to your question, is anyone else doing it really well? I don't really see it, to be honest. There aren't many who are running programs like that at the moment. Really the big providers are the ones who I think core responsible, the Facebooks and others, and they've come a long way. We had a period where they all didn't want to do anything, but these days Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram and all those have got pretty sophisticated policies. And that's about as good as you're going to get, I think, in terms of real management of it. And so the responsibility is lying with the providers who actually do this stuff.
But I agree, as an educator, I think that's somewhere we have to move. We spent a lot of time telling youth how to find information. Now we have to tell them how to make sense of information, how to critique and analyze information. And no longer do we need to tell them how to find it. The answer is simple, it's Google. So we do need to start developing ways to have a critical analysis of information from the time you're, here. I think that is something that we do need to develop straight from primary school on, that critical analysis of information is going to be really important. And it's something that not just the well-educated need, everyone needs it, because you see, while there are plenty of people who are educated to critique, there are plenty who are just buying the first thing and the most dynamic thing and the most interesting thing they read. And so I think it is absolutely a program that we need to start to develop at every level of education.
Yeah, I would say both in terms of the ability to critique things, and the kids today, obviously, in high school, they have so much information at their disposal. But as you say, Zena, the ability to judge what is a reliable source and the ability to critically analyse the value of what comes up in front of them when they type something into a search engine. I think we need to do better at that in our already overcrowded curriculum. And I also think citizenship, I really do think, I'm a bit old-fashioned that way, I think that when it comes to young ones, really strengthening and improving citizenship programs, teaching our kids what a public service is for and really about the machinery of government is pretty important, and I'd like to see more of that in our school system.
Time is ticking away so quickly, even though it is right before drinks, as Tom keeps reminding us. But there is time for one more question. I think I saw one up here.
Thank you. Very fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could talk for a lot longer. Picking up on your point and points made earlier today about really changing the way we work with communities and having two-way, more constructive and honest conversations, and the use of social media or new media to do so. I'm interested in the concept of echo chambers and the inability of government to actually cut through and break into those to actually get messages in. I'm interested in your thoughts on what we can do rather than government jumping in, starting to use new platforms, pouring lots of money into things that are messages that are not hitting the market. What can we do to combat those sort of echo chambers, and who can we be working with to get messages into those worlds?
So just don't, I'm not saying this critically, I wouldn't say combat echo chambers. Echo chambers have always existed. They're sort of the people gather in churches and town halls and sporting clubs and yarn on, and so we've always had that sense of so it's not that, it's just, I think it's got a bit more obvious and a bit more definition sometimes in some of these places. I'm a big fan of public agencies really trying to take what I call the circus tent approach, and so you look, you're part of a big circus tent and you're one big tent pole, but there's a whole lot of other sort of smaller bits going on the circus, and you're certainly not the circus master anymore, so forget that little piece. But understand who's in your circus tent and then work with them. There'll be service providers, there'll be interest groups, there'll be citizen-empowered propositions, there'll be all sorts of people. There'll be stakeholders, including your own ministers, etc. Bring them, create this circus tent and understand that circus tent, and then sort of work it like a circus rather than some linear proposition. And some days you have a good day and the circus goes really well, and the next day it's not so good. But every time you get better at playing it, and then all of a sudden you'll find there's a lot of one thing I certainly found was there's a lot of goodwill. People basically want the system to work, and you'll find they'll gravitate to you. And those sort of people will start saying, yeah, what the Department of XXS is right. We've been there before, that's right. And so all of a sudden you'll find you are an influencer yourself, and that much more dynamic way of thinking about it. So really understand who that ecosystem is. Really pen them out and say who they are, who are those influencers, etc. Who are the people who are not so important, not so influential as well, because if you can feed them and make them feel more empowered, they feel better. That's the audience right up in the back seats who couldn't quite afford to pay the best seats. So try and think like that, and then all of a sudden you're feeling, everyone feeling part of the same, circus. And that gives you a much more dynamic way to think about it. So understand the ecosystem and then work it would be my sort of crude, big picture view.
Any other comments? Or?
Very, very briefly, from experience in the defence and national security arena to a lesser extent in foreign policy, I think there is great advantage in working with some of the better think tanks. I chaired ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, for 7 years. Lowy Institute's another good example. Working with the think tanks to broaden the effort to bring people in who do have alternative views, even provocative views. So there's a certain dissent built in to some of the arguments, and continue with that. I think the think tanks can sometimes help in achieving policy outcomes that public agencies may not be able to do just by themselves.
Yeah, and they adds getting new DNA is so vital, I think, and at that point that Steve makes. And go look for some of the ratbag organisations too. Bring them in and hear what they're saying, because they can often behind that there's some smart people. They just have to have got what I call the ratbags. You're sort of noisy on the side, because they'll just give you something that the more formal think tanks. I used to work in one in Washington. It was great, but we were part of the system. And Brookings and all those people, they are part of the system, and even Lowy and those, because they sort of play the adult game. And like I was saying, gee, you've got to bring some others in here and give everyone a sense that, everyone's got a voice in this system, and then you'll start tapping it. But the think tanks, I think, are much underused by government, and they could be commissioning a lot of work out there and getting some thought going in a much more sort of longer term point, to Stephen's point about strategy. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to have to leave it there. But please join me in thanking Stephen, Tom, and Michelle for what was, I think, an incredibly interesting session.